morning. And I would like first to thank our hosts, Kimberly and Patrick. I think this is an excellent forum and much needed. It's surprising that it wasn't created about 10 years ago, but it's a privilege to be here. I am BT Slingsby. I am from the CHIT Fund. The CHIT Fund is a Global Health Innovative Technology Fund coming out of Japan for global health. We focus on R&D of drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics. And before I begin my presentation, I first want to stress and agree with George in terms of access. Access is paramount to any technology. It's probably the most important aspect of any technology that we have today. And looking at how we can assure that safe and efficacious, effective technologies are, one, affordable, available, and adopted in the countries. Without that, no matter how much we invest in R&D, no matter how much we invest in innovation, it's meaningless. So even though that our fund is looking at how to drive forward more innovation from Japan for global health indications, we keep that in mind as a founding principle in all of our proposals, in all of our investments, and all of our partnerships going forward. So this morning, very cold this morning, I'm a runner and ran through the mall. A similar park that I run through in Tokyo is called Yoyogi Koen. And this is it. Today, it looks like this. It was 70 years, this last summer, dengue fever arrived back into Tokyo. And it was the first time in 70 years. 70 years. A neglected tropical disease coming back to Tokyo. And it was only about 1970s in Japan in which still lymphatic filariasis, schistosomiasis, these other tropical diseases were endemic in many areas of Japan. So not that long ago. In terms of dengue, if we look at the correlation between human mobility and the incidence of dengue over the last 30 years, you can see more or less a correlation. Currently, dengue is in over 100 countries worldwide, and the people at risk is little less than half of our world population. In fact, 43% of our world population today are at risk of a neglected tropical disease, malaria or tuberculosis. 14% of the world population is currently infected with these diseases. Now, if we look at the amount of technology and the amount of investment that's going into these diseases today, historically between 2000 and 2011, only 1% of the drugs that came out of the FDA were for these indications. So you see the great disparity between actual want or need out there and the innovation and investment that's going into these diseases. If we look on a more granular level and look at the new chemical entities, which we discussed briefly 2 days ago, these are kind of the actual active ingredients that go into really novel drugs, novel mechanisms of action for antibiotics, antimalarics, antivirals. If you look at those new chemical entities, it's a historic trend of going down and down. The reason being is because the net present value or the investment in these potential innovations from the private sector is just not justifiable. You can create a new drug using an existing chemical entity or existing molecular entity. And if you do that, the risk in terms of, or the probability of success actually goes up. So from an investment point of view, investing in these new molecular entities is actually a poor investment. And thus, you see the trend before you. In terms of, on the other hand, in terms of once you create these anti-infectives, how profitable are they? This is a slide that's coming out of the market of Japan. Now, Japan is the #2 pharmaceutical market in the world behind the US. And if you look at the trend in terms of anti-infectives, it's going down and down and down. In fact, anti-infectives are no longer top 10 in Japan in terms of market share. And this does not have to do with what I've just mentioned in terms of tropical diseases being endemic in Japan up until the 1960s or so, because this data is from the 1990s onwards. So regardless if you invest in anti-infectives, and particularly new medical entities, the probability of success in terms of getting those out the door is relatively high. But once you get them out the door, really the market is not there and the prices are not there to actually pull in back the return on that investment. So with that, you often have a market failure. Private sector is really simply just not investing in the new R&D for these drugs and vaccines. And what we do as one push mechanism throughout the world is to try to push that investment forward. We're a public-private partnership that once again is putting in that investment so that R&D can occur, product development occur, and the cycle goes on and on. So how is our investment set up? We're a fund, we're a public-private partnership between the Japanese government, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and 5 pharmaceutical companies. It's interesting to note that it's precisely 50% that the government's putting in. It's a matching fund. And if you look at other organizations throughout the world, anywhere from Gavi to Global Fund to IMI, which is an organization in Europe that drives forward antibiotic R&D, it's usually about 90%, or in some cases 95% government, and only about 5% private sector. So here, private sector is putting their skin in the game, as they say, in which it's clearly a public-private partnership. And the reason for this is everyone's approaching this as really an investment. They're not just doing this out of charity. The pharmaceutical companies that are involved would like to no longer depend on multinational organizations to sell their products in the developing world. They want to go global. So with that, they'll have to become engaged in global issues. And becoming engaged in global issues as a pharmaceutical company means global health. So this is an investment from the company's perspective. From the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's perspective as well, they've set up many organizations throughout the last 10, 15 years called product development partnerships to drive forward R&D. These organizations have been trying to tap into the unique chemical compound libraries of Japan for over a decade. They were not able to do that. With this organization, it happened within a month. And then in terms of the government, we often talk about created share value from the corporate perspective. But it's rather interesting to look at the share created value from the government perspective. What does a country get out of? What does the US get out of? What does Japan get out of participating in global health? If they just do it for charity, it's really not sustainable. So in terms of Japan, there's actually 3 policies. One is the Japan Revitalization Strategy. As we all see about 2 days ago, it's probably not working as well as we want to, but that's one. The other is with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that's with the new Japan Strategy for Global Health Diplomacy. As you saw, it was on the cover of Lancet. And then lastly, in terms of health and medical strategy. And this is to try to drive forward innovation within Japan. There's often called a death valley when you're speaking about drug development that occurs between discovery and clinical development. And in Japan, it's quite large. So through this, we're actually trying to bring a new form of R&D to Japan, and that is R&D through partnership, or as some call it, open innovation. In Japan, often, companies work in silos, historically speaking. But through our initiative, we're bringing a new form of R&D, and that is R&D through partnership. I wanted to touch base a little about on the historical context or on the ecosystem, as Bob said 2 days ago, in terms of where Japan fits within in the world in terms of drug development. It's number 3. Few know this because Japanese corporations do not always sell or distribute their drugs throughout the world. They license them out. But if you look at actually the innovation for drug development, it's number 3 in the world. And within Japan, the pharmaceutical industry is paramount in terms of R&D expenditure. Higher than automobiles, higher than electronics, and likewise, it's number 1 in terms of a tax revenue. So from the Japanese government perspective, unless their pharmaceutical company continues to grow and continues to succeed in terms of innovation and in terms of becoming more globalized, then it's a disbenefit to the government and the country itself. So this is what I would say is created share value for the government itself, is this type of initiative. So we began in April of last year, a little over a year and a half. And what we've done to date is 30 partnerships. 22 of these partnerships we have facilitated between Japanese organizations and non-Japanese organizations. In fact, the fundamental, or one of the only criteria or criterion for any of our investments is a partnership between a Japanese organization and a non-Japanese organization. In some cases, this involves organizations in the developing world. But in many occasions, it doesn't. We do not make that as a criterion. We look at, in terms of our innovation, we look at how innovative or how novel that technology is, how good the management is, and how successful this product development can be in terms of one of our portfolio investments. Another thing I wanted to touch on, that if you look at the portfolio right now, and if you look at the preclinical and hit-to-lead programs, all of those are for new chemical entities, new molecular entities. If you look at a similar portfolio for a pharmaceutical company, it's usually very much a minority in terms of new molecular or chemical entities. Here, it's 100% of our investment in terms of preclinical. So this is where, even if we are developing these for a neglected tropical disease, or malaria, or tuberculosis, other indications can be brought on later. Like these, for instance, for tuberculosis, this can be an antibiotic. So the fact that we're pushing forward innovation in terms of anti-infectives can be applied beyond our indications here that are shown. So how do we decide on our partnerships and our investments? We have a 3-stage funding mechanism. We call for proposals. Proposals come in, there's peer review. These are external independent reviewers. Those are aggregated, they're shared to the selection committee. Selection committee are the folks that you see on the screen right there. The top proposals are called in for an interview, and then those are recommended to our board, and the board decides on those. Now, as you have made notice, in our portfolio, many of our funders can actually be our investees or our grantees. So how do we come over that conflict of interest? And this last slide, I wanted to touch on governments. So setting up this fund was very interesting. I was at Eisai, which was one of the pharmaceutical companies at that time, and we actually incubated it within that pharmaceutical company. But for over 10 months, the 5 pharmaceutical companies, the 2 ministries that are involved, and the Gates Foundation met on a bi-weekly basis to look at what is going to be the articles of incorporation, the policies, the management, who's going to be on the selection committee, the board, the council. And through that process, we actually discussed quite heatedly in terms of potential conflicts of interest. And one of the very obvious potential conflicts of interest is if a pharmaceutical company is one of our funders, and if they could become a beneficiary of this fund, how do we get them out of the entire decision-making process? So as you can see here, they're not on the board, they're not on the selection committee, they're not on the advisory panel, and they're not on the management team. The council itself is more of an advocacy role. The only decisions that they're involved in is if we want to change our articles of incorporation and if they approve our audited finances. Those are the only two that they participate on an annual basis. Everything else occurs at the selection committee and the board level. So we've taken them completely out of the picture in terms of the decision making, and thus that allows us to overcome that conflict of interest. Now, other organizations that have this type of funding consistency, they often involve private sector on the board, and then arguments occur and it's not as sustainable as we want it to be. So I'll leave it there, but I did want to touch on this governance issue because it's very paramount in terms of how healthy our organization is run going forward. Even if you look at the members of our board or the members of our management team particularly, there is no seconded individuals on our management team. And this is rather a rarity in Japan in terms of nobody from government, from the Gates Foundation, from many of the pharmaceutical companies is on the management team. So we're trying to run this as independently as possible, however, with the support from both public and private sectors. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to the discussion.
BT, thank you very much indeed. That's just a fascinating model, and I know I have a lot of questions, and I know the audience will. Let's go, however, straight to Adrian so that he can give us the news from Gavi, and then we'll open the floor to discussion.
Thank you very much.